So, good morning to all of you. This is day 2 of this lovely conference. I hope that the people who were here yesterday already, and I see many familiar faces, had a good night's rest and a beautiful walk in the sunshine, because what a lovely city this is. Wow. And we start rather early, but then we are still fresh to hear the insights of Robert Vosloo. And we are very proud and happy to have Robert Vosloo here in our midst. It's a first for him to go to ESITIS. You can sort of look up the small bio that is in the program, so I won't bore you with all the beautiful works that Robert has written. I can assure you it's worth your while to read him. He is an expert in Bonhoeffer. He has written on Barth, so he is really in the heart of the classical theological writers, you could say. But he also wrote on hospitality. And I have been in Stellenbosch in South Africa, and I have been a guest of your beautiful university. And I know that the hospitality is close to your heart. Also, incidentally, we discovered yesterday that he is very knowledgeable about wine. And this is not very strange for somebody coming from Stellenbosch, because the University of Stellenbosch is lying in the midst of the vineyards of South Africa, where the most tasteful wine in the world is being produced. But when we listen to him, we are thinking of hospitality and wine, but he will tell us about discourses. And I really look forward to hearing your lecture about that.
Yes, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Gey. And for me, it's a real privilege to be here this morning. And thank you also, Yasser, for the kind invitation. And greetings then also from Stellenbosch in South Africa. I didn't bring any wine with me, but it was really very, very kind that we also had some South African wine last night at the dinner. And so that made me feel very much at home. So, yes, in terms of my presentation this morning, the title of my paper is Religious Traditions, Intellectual Postures, and Incompleteness in Search of a Responsible Hermeneutic of Tradition. So, in his little book, The Vindication of Tradition, published in 1984, 40 years ago, the Orthodox historian Jaroslav Pelikan recalls an incident where a lecturer chided a group of students for having no sense of tradition and for supposing that the history of music begins with Bob Dylan. Then one of the students asked, "Bob who?" Now this anecdote reiterates an experience that many people today might well want to apply to their own cultural and religious tradition. Namely, the experience of a growing sense of ignorance and apathy towards the past, a sort of historical amnesia that does not do justice to tradition. Therefore, there seems to be some justification in the call that a greater historical sense of tradition is needed, and for the intellectual engagement, also for the intellectual engagement with culture and religion. Now, this said, such an emphasis on tradition can also smack of a kind of cultural chauvinism, whereby my plea for the importance of tradition is merely a way of stating that others should know what I or like-minded people know, and that others should gain access to this knowledge in the same way as I do, with the same methodology. In the call for papers for our conference, it is mentioned in the description of our theme for this morning that the dominance of certain European Western typologies and models often adopted a priori as the only possible approaches, permeates the whole fabric of studying religious traditions, and that attention therefore should be drawn to these patterns and their power. And it further states that we should ask which patterns guides our conceptualizations of religion and tradition in our contemporary context. Now, with this in mind, there seems indeed to be a continual need for what I would like to call in this paper a hermeneutic of tradition, also for the study of religion and practices of intercultural and interreligious engagement. So in this paper, I would like to contribute to such an endeavor by making a few comments on some of the possible contours or outlines of such a hermeneutic. And I will proceed in 3 steps. Firstly, I would like to affirm the skepticism against the skepticism of tradition and the concomitant need to distinguish between tradition and traditionalism. Secondly, I want to interrogate, drawing on the work of scholars like the Yale theologian Willie Jennings, how a certain view of tradition as a stable entity enforces particular harmful intellectual postures. The paper also utilizes the notion of incompleteness in conversation with the University of Cape Town cultural anthropologist Francis Jomjo's work on populism, to point, and this is the 3rd point, to a timeful hermeneutic of tradition marked by emphasis on hospitality, lingering, and becoming. So let me then turn to the first section on tradition and traditionalism. In the preface of his book published in 1981 and simply titled Tradition, the Chicago sociologist Edward Chills observed that while there are many books about particular traditions and about tradition in particular religions, literature, art, and law, there is no book about tradition which tries to see the common ground and elements of tradition and which analyzes what difference tradition makes in human life. And then Chills aims to address this gap in critical scholarship. Given the influence of Enlightenment rationality and scientific knowledge, Chills argues, change and innovation have become coterminous with progress and improvement, while traditionality has become connected with ignorance and superstition. Chills is skeptical of this skepticism towards tradition inherited from the Enlightenment, and his work can be seen as an attempt to revive the notion of tradition against this impulse. The work of the moral philosopher Alistair MacIntyre is motivated by a similar concern. I will not go into the detail of MacIntyre's critique of tradition-free reasoning and his description of tradition as a living tradition, that is, in his words, an historically extended, socially embodied argument, and an argument precisely about the goods which constitute a tradition. But for our purposes here, one can add that MacIntyre, like Chills, is critical of the modernist legacy that presents itself as a tradition of non-tradition. Any attempt to revive the notion of tradition is, of course, confronted with the baggage associated with the idea of tradition. In the name of tradition, systems of oppression and injustice is often kept intact. Any fossilized understanding of tradition is thereby highly problematic. Therefore, the need to differentiate between tradition and traditionalism. Jaroslav Pelikan's oft-quoted remark remains helpful here when he writes, "Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living." More recently, the Christian theologian David Bentley Hart has also utilized, in his book titled Tradition and Apocalypse, an essay on the future of Christian belief, the distinction between tradition and traditionalism, describing traditionalism as a fretful, even at times neurotic fixation upon the past configurations of the faith that one remembers from childhood, or remembers one parents remembering, or remember hearing about those who vaguely remember remembering. Now, such a traditionalism does not understand the fullness of a living tradition. Over against such a reduction, Hart states, and I quote him, "A tradition, in its full sense, is truly vital to the degree that it's always in a state of patient but dynamic reconstruction. Here, recollection, imagination, and inspired invention must work in inseparable concert." One should also add that it is the thrust of Hart's argument in Tradition and Apocalypse that traditionalists resent the disruptive vitality of a living tradition. Therefore, one finds within religious traditions the struggle between, on the one hand, those who guard the religious and social stability of the tradition, and on the other hand, those who uphold what Hart calls, as a Christian theologian, the apocalyptic ferment of the gospel. Hence the claim that true fidelity to what is most original in a tradition entails this play between stability and disruption. It requires an openness to the future in the light of the past's promise. Although there is often contestation, including concerning the respective historical analyses and constructive proposals between the voices from various traditions that critique a static traditionalism, they nevertheless share the view that faithful and liberating speech should not be equated with the mere repetition of ideas from the past or the statements of authoritative figures. A responsible historical hermeneutic is about what can be called a traditioned creativity, a hermeneutic that displays sensitivity for the ages and the moment, for historicity and contextuality, for tradition and creativity. One can thus say, or so I argue, that such a historic hermeneutic is not about mere repetition, but about performative and participatory remembering, requiring what Catherine Pickstock calls, in conversation with Kierkegaard, non-identical repetition. In a certain sense, total repetition is, of course, not possible. Kierkegaard's famous example of his return visit to Berlin to see if identical repetition is possible confirms this. Even if you try to replicate a previous travel experience as carefully as possible, it is still not the same. So for Kierkegaard, the kind of real repetition that he pleads for is not linked to the memory of external places, but rather refers to an inner quality of life that draws its freedom from the past and is able to act in the present as part of a process of remembering forward. The faithfulness to tradition requires more than mere repetition, or a different kind of repetition in the Kierkegaardian sense. Tradition is indeed a dynamic process with conversation and even argument and conflict being vital to the life of a tradition. As the South African theologian John de Gruchy observes, traditions stay alive precisely because those who share them are in conversation with the past and in debate with each other. This is how traditions are reinvented from one context to the next, how they break open to appropriate the new rather than break down. In arguing for a hermeneutic of tradition creativity, one should understand this being traditioned in a dynamic way. Faithfulness to the tradition does not exclude, but actually requires fresh articulation. In this sense, a living tradition stands over the sort of traditionalism that has rightly been the target of many critiques. This is the first aspect that I would like to highlight in this conversation about the search for a responsible hermeneutic of tradition. To this, I would like to underscore, also add a second aspect, and that is that the plea for a renewed retrieval of the notion of tradition can itself be a masked form of conservatism. The new traditionalist can turn out to be a crypto-fundamentalist. In this regard, some comments by the African-American theologian Willie Jennings are, in my view, instructive. In a book symposium on his monograph, After Whiteness, A Pedagogy of Belonging, published in 2021 in the Theological Journal, Modern Theology, Jennings responds to his interlocutors in an article that he titles, Against the Finished Man. He observes herein that the title of his book, After Whiteness, gestures not so much to some kind of post-racial future, but that it's a play on Alistair MacIntyre's influential book, After Virtue, a pivotal book in his own theological journey. And in this book, MacIntyre, as many of you will know, recovers notions of virtue, tradition, practices, narrative, and so on. Now, Jennings writes as follows about the reception of MacIntyre's thought on virtue and tradition, and it's worth quoting him at length. He writes, it offers a path towards cultivating a comprehensive theological identity. Yet through its digestion and dissemination, I watched a colonial process of formation assert itself in and through the grasping of something called tradition. What I saw was less a matter of MacIntyre's philosophical project and much more a matter of theological longing. I watched people aim their life towards a vision of maturity that bridges an imagined past to current intellectual postures. But the past was not what was actually brought forward, but instead a person held tightly in a dream of coherence and clarity that had merged with the colonial master's dream of the control of spaces. If I can just repeat that last part, but what was actually brought forward was a person held tightly in the dream of coherence and clarity that had merged with the colonial master's dream of the control of spaces. What I take from Jennings's comment is not so much a critique against the notion of tradition as such, as an exposure of how the rhetoric of tradition can be in service of a type of colonial desire associated with the trope of white, self-sufficient men guided by control, possession, and mastery. According to such a mentality, we know and control the tradition and become the gatekeepers of a polished and coherent tradition we have mastered through our grasp. These remarks by Jennings challenge the conceptualization and rhetoric of tradition in which notions such as comprehensiveness, coherence, and clarity are used as tools to exclude, in part because this understanding of tradition does not allow for ambiguity, messiness, contradiction, and plurality. As Jennings writes, coherence, clarity, consistency, these are not bad words, but when executed through colonialist desire, they pull scholarly aspiration towards controlling gestures. Jennings rightly points to the harmful ways in which the notion of tradition can be utilized in our discourses. It can easily slip into a totalizing concept in which we imagine that we can fully oversee tradition as a whole and a polished entity. Much more can be said against any romanticizing or indeed any one-sided demonization of the past of a religious tradition. But for our purposes here, I want to underscore the idea that the lack of an understanding of a tradition as complex, ambivalent, and messy quickly leads to reductive and often outright false constructions of a coherent and all-comprehensive tradition. The understanding of tradition that Jennings points towards challenged the rhetoric in which tradition is put into service of over-triumphant claims, a rhetoric often found in populist discourse. The work of the Cameroonian social anthropologist that works at the University of Cape Town, Francis Jomjo, on populism is instructive in this regard. In his book, Incompleteness, with the subtitle Donald Trump, Populism and Citizenship, he argues for the value of the notion of incompleteness, seeing it not as a negative attribute, but as something to embrace and celebrate, as we in all humility seek to act and interact with each other. For him, to recognize and provide for incompleteness is not to plead guilty, inadequate, inferior, or helpless vis-à-vis supposedly complete pace-setting others. Incompleteness is not therefore something one should progress from to what might be called completeness, since the latter is a perilous illusion, especially if defined in zero-sum terms as independence and autonomy. This easily develops in a kind of arrogance in which one don't recognize your own debt and indebtedness to others. Over against such an attitude, Jomjo writes, and I quote him, "When one provides for incompleteness as a permanent feature and disabuses oneself of ambitions of dominance, one develops a disposition that privileges interconnections, interdependence, and the reality of debt and indebtedness as an essential aspect of being and belonging together." I think this quote gets to the heart of Jomjo's argument. Hence, incompleteness affirms the need for a permanent suspicion towards absolute and the acknowledgement that we are who we are through a process of interdependence and indebtedness that living and letting live entails. Therefore, Jomjo also links completeness to conviviality, another important concept for him, and what he calls Ubuntu relationships with incomplete others. And he sees Ubuntu, the African notion, as a social organizing principle that encourages a life of mutuality, obligation, and reciprocity. It emphasizes a continuous act of sharing and giving to maintain a balance of reciprocity between oneself and others. Jomjo sees the logic and practice of incompleteness as a healthy antidote to the cheap and toxic recipe of name-calling and scapegoating of others as undesirable outsiders, depending on the brand of populism at play. Drawing on the work of Willie Jennings and Francis Jomjo, one can therefore argue that next to the movement from a static to a dynamic understanding of tradition, a responsible hermeneutic of tradition also requires the second movement, the movement from hegemonic coherence to the category of incompleteness. And maybe I can also say that this notion of incompleteness also resonates with the work of the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur in his work Memory, History and Forgetting, where he grapples with the hermeneutic of historical consciousness. He ends this work on memory and history and forgetting with this little poem of 4 lines saying, under history, memory and forgetting. Under memory and forgetting, life. But writing a life is another story. And then he ends the book with this one word, incompleteness. The work of theorists like Ricoeur and that is particularly that I highlighted from the paper Jennings and also Jamjo reminds us and intimates a third movement that I, in closing, want to affirm. That is the movement from the view that deals with difference within and between tradition in reactionary and combative terms to a more timeful hermeneutic marked by hospitality, lingering, and becoming. The test for any hermeneutic of tradition is, of course, how it accounts for difference, or maybe more pointedly, the different. Our encounter with difference in all its particularity does not, one should add, occur in a historical and political vacuum. Our encounters are set within complicated histories, often stamped by the memory of trauma and injustice. Therefore, the question, if we can imagine a form of social and political encounter, also religious encounters, that is more than competitive and combative. And here I want to refer to a book by the German theologian Ulrich Schmiedel that also grapples with this question titled Terror and Theology. And I would like to call attention to a chapter in this book on the concept of recognition or anerkennung, in which he engages with the thought of the Anglican theologian Rowan Williams. Now, Schmiedel points out how Williams is well aware that it is naive to have a politics devoid of competitive interests. And he is also not favoring a cozy communitarianism that absolves itself from the difficulties of managing real difference and real inequality. Yet his plea for imagining an engagement with difference in a different way favors a more conversational and collaborative approach that moves beyond a stark friend-enemy dichotomy. In his reflections on post-9/11 political theology, Schmiedel too wants to imagine a political system that is not wholly competitive and trapped within the friend-enemy schema. Therefore, his plea for a comparative and coalition-seeking multi-religious reflective praxis that imagines something beyond Carl Schmitt's influential friend-enemy distinction or Samuel Huntington's clash of civilizations. In the process, Schmiedel illuminates well how the idea of making room is crucial for Williams's account of recognition. And here he refers to a book by Williams written after 9/11 and that reflects on it, titled Writing in the Dust. And in this book, and Williams was self also during that time, as many of you might know, in New York and experienced something of the terror of the moment. But he then refers to this by saying, someone who is about to die in terrible anguish makes room in their mind for something else, for the grief and terror of someone they love. That moment of making room is what I, as a religious person, have to notice. It isn't pious. It isn't language about God. It's simply language that brings into the world something other than self-defensiveness. It is a breathing space in the asthmatic climate of self-concern and competition. For Williams and for Schmiedel, such a breathing space can counter the language of violence, polarization, and war. By making room, the other is viewed as other and different, without absolutizing the other's alterity. And in the process, communication and conversation amidst plurality becomes possible. Williams ends this book, Writing in the Dust, with a reference to the story from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, where Jesus writes in the dust when a woman is accused of adultery. And one can ask, why did Jesus do this according to this account in the Gospel of John? Why did he stop and wrote in the dust? Now, for Williams, one possible reason for this is that Jesus thereby allows a longish moment in which people are given time to see themselves differently. So, making room for the recognition of difference in our religious reflection and praxis, also for taking this longish moment, for lingering, can be seen as a form of writing in the dust, because in Williams's words, it tries to hold the moment a little longer, long enough for some of our demons to walk away. Let me conclude. What I would like to take from Williams's work and Smeedle's reading thereof is that it points to an account of tradition in which tradition utilizes the sources and resources within their traditions to underscore the potential of making room and taking time as antidote to reactionary models, often associated with the Western European intellectual tradition, that are overdetermined by the friend-enemy distinction, freeing us also from the harmful intellectual postures that result from when we don't see traditions as fragile, plural, fragmentary, and incomplete. A responsible hermeneutic of tradition, therefore, resists hegemonic control and is marked by the sense of incompleteness that invites, in Jamjo's words, exploration, contemplation, and openness to infinite interconnections, fluidities, and conviviality. So the point here is that incompleteness as a category has not got to do with an absence, with a lack, but with possibility, with potentiality. Such a hermeneutic privileges a future-oriented understanding of identity that gives priority to being, to becoming over being. Tradition denotes not merely what we have received and what we are, but also what we can become and what we can receive and what we can give. Therefore, I like the response that the Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig is said to have given when they asked him, "Are you religious?" And to this, Rosenzweig tellingly responded, "Not yet." Thank you.